I'd like to introduce Derak Ford. Derak is an assistant professor of education studies at DePauw University and an instructor with the People's Forum. They teach and research about how pedagogical theory can advance political struggles. He is the author of 7 monographs, the latest of which are Encountering Education, Elements for Marxist Pedagogy. Derak's popular writing has appeared in outlets such as Monthly Review and Black Agenda Report. They are the editor of Liberation School and the education department chair at the Hampton Institute, a working class think tank. And they recently led and narrated the podcast series, Reading Capital with Comrades. Derak's speech is titled The Complexity of Time, History, Revolution, and the Future in Marx's Capital. Their speech focuses on those who misread Marx's Capital as a Eurocentric work that universalizes and totalizes history into a linear and progressive narrative. They demonstrate how colonialism was central to Capital and how Capital and Marx's work not only articulated the intimate connections between workers' movements and the struggles against slavery and colonialism, but also how it never assumed that history was linear or progressive or stagist, nor did it universalize any English story onto the whole world. So please welcome Derak.
Thank you so much, comrades, and it's really great to be here. And if there's any problems with my audio or video, just let me know because my connection might not be very secure. So yeah, first, I wanted to thank everybody and just also note like the wide variety of organizations and institutions and individuals who are behind this webinar. I think it's really, quite indicative of really a sea change that we can be a part of in terms of moving intellectual thought out of the academy and back into the actual popular movements. And in particular, differentiating academics from intellectuals, because we know that they are not the same. So, just to pick up on where Gabriel left off, I think in my own field, critical pedagogy, the actual field, critical pedagogy, originated, as Karim Malat showed, as an anti-communist break in the early 1980s. Paulo Freire never talked about his work as being critical pedagogy. North Americans took up his work and made it into critical pedagogy and basically established their credentials on these very anti-Marxist themes that Gabriel was talking about. And then my comments also, I think, build on Radika's insistence that Capital is not merely a work of theory, but also a work of history, and that those two things aren't separable. So to begin, I think, I was actually reading Frederick Jameson's early work in the 1980s about cognitive mapping. And, he says that the real crisis of Marxism at the time is really a crisis in ideology, in the sense that ideology is something that grips the masses and shows them a potential different future as possible. And at the time, importantly, he said that Cuba and Yugoslavia were some of those countries that were providing that ideological hope. But that's just sort of an aside. So our task today as socialists in the United States and in North America is, it is greater in some respects than the historical task, because it's not about the setbacks the movement has endured, because setbacks are much more frequent than victories. It's really an ideological struggle in that the ideological continuity that marked the workers' movements for a century has really been broken, so that Marxism has become just sort of one pole or one theory amongst a plethora of others in academia from which we can sort of take things and whatever. And as a result, there's a lot of misunderstandings. And I don't blame the people, who propagate these, because oftentimes it just comes from not reading Capital itself. It comes from reading comments on Capital. And so I think that's why it's so important to read the book and to read it collectively. And I noticed that, the very first sentence of Capital, Marx says that the wealth of the wealth in those societies in which the capitalist production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. Many people are interested in how it presents itself as that, which means it isn't that. But what I'm interested in is when Marx says that the capitalist mode of production prevails. He doesn't say it's exclusive. He doesn't say it's obliterated all other modes of production. And this is really important. When you go to the index of the International Publishers edition of Capital to mode of production, there's nothing there. It instead points you to socioeconomic formations. And this distinction, I think, is very key because all social formations are combinations of different modes of production, some that are sort of ascending, some that are descending, but they're all locked in struggle with each other. And so, the historical sense that we get from that is not one in which one stage supersedes the next stage to replace it in a sort of linear developmental process, but one in which, the past and the future and the present are sort of heterogeneously blocked together. And the distinction between social formation and modes of production is crucial because it acknowledges that there's different kinds of time, different spatial arrangements in any given society. And so, Marx justifies his analysis of capitalism based primarily on England in the first forewords to the first edition of Capital, because it's where capitalism was most advanced, and so where its logic was most easily sort of abstractable. But even in this advanced state, he says, England suffered from, quote, a whole series of inherited evils arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, with their inevitable train of social and political anachronism, together with the modern evils of capitalism. So if readers in other places disregard the book as a result, he says, they miss what capital's logic might do to their own countries. And so he explicitly states that the different levels of capitalism in different regions isn't a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonism, but because what's at issues are the laws themselves, which are going to be, as he constantly reminds us, adjusted in their actual operation. And so in the last part of Capital, Volume 1, to give just one example, he provides the key to deciphering why capital was so advanced in England. And it had nothing to do with what was happening in England. It had to do with the fact that England was the center of world colonialism. Capitalism was advanced in England because of, among other things, as he wrote, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, national and international debts, the discovery of gold and silver, their extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of Black people, and slavery, pure and simple, in the United States. So this is what makes England so advanced capitalistically, is because of its role in colonialism and slavery and genocide and so on and so forth. And then the very last chapter, of course, is about colonialism, right? And I think that's really what allows Marx to then open up his entire theoretical analysis apparatus and all the inquiry that he's done into a new stage, right? Where, these things aren't just going to be resolved because they can take on different forms through colonialism. And of course, in Volume 3, Marx writes that colonialism is one of the countervailing tendencies to the rate of profit to fall, which I believe Alan will be talking about later on. So throughout Capital, Marx articulates how such uneven combinations of time produce the time of capitalist economic production that's constructed out of the reality of these different rhythms, right? So there's the rhythms of necessary and surplus labor, the turnover of various components of capital, the aggregate of the total social capital, the biological times, the social times of living beings, of labor power, transportation, finance capital, none of which can be read immediately in the flow of any given process. So there's no uniform, continuous, and permanent time that operates from the Earth's genesis until now, or from capital's genesis until now. The idea in our experience of time is the product of capital. And so one political task that pedagogy for me assumes is the knowledge and the sensation of the different kinds of times and modes of production that are present in the present, right? That enable us to connect our current conjuncture with the ongoing developments of the class struggle and to really perceive the possibility and the actuality of revolution. And so Harry Haroutunian has a thesis that basically a lot of this comes from certain Western Marxists' take on formal versus real subsumption as a historical account rather than as an analytical model. So how am I doing on time, Patricia?
You've got 4 more minutes.
Okay, great. So formal subsumption or subjection is when capital takes, the production process as it finds it, prolongates the working day. And then real subjection or real subsumption is when capital modifies that process, primarily by taking the knowledge and skills from the workers themselves and putting them into machinery. And so But Marx is using this as an analytical model, not as a historical analytic to understand the passage of time. And so this is why I've always preferred the translation of the International Publishers, which is subjection to subsumption, because subjection allows for some autonomy of different modes of production, different temporalities, and so on and so forth. And so, Harry Haratunian's argument is really because Marx saw capitalism as hosting such a vast heterogeneous inventory of times, that that's what made it precisely so effective. And nothing reveals this more really than Marx's openness to his suggestion that the surviving communes in 19th century Russia are progressive relative to capitalism. And even in the Grundrisse notebooks, the late 1850s, Marx rejected any linear causality that envisioned a singularly progressive movement from one period of production to the next. Sometimes this comes about as the sort of didactic context in which they were writing, right? Which is why Marx and Engels stressed the economic aspects of the base and the superstructure, because they were writing against those who would deny that, right? And so here's the other thing is that, and I'll close with this, is that the sense in which Marx said he wasn't a Marxist, if we're to believe Engels, isn't because he, didn't like the label per se, but because it wasn't his thought. It was the thought of the international working class movement. And so the theory that he develops isn't the theory of Marx, it's the theory of the working class struggle. And so we can see this in various points, especially in volume 1. Take the chapter 10 on the working day, when Marx has constructed this, theoretical apparatus based on capital's own laws, and then he brings it to its limit, right? Where between equal rights force the sides. And what he's saying is that this theory can't be solved in theory. It's only solved in practice. And he's opening it up to political struggle, because that's what advances theory. And so I think, obviously, another one is the section on primitive accumulation, right? And nowhere in that section does Marx say, this is the story, this is the story of everything, this is how it's going to be, and so on and so forth. It's really the fact that knowledge doesn't produce politics, politics produces knowledge. And so for those of us in the United States trying to build the socialist movement, socialism is popular. What we have to do is we have to give definition and precision to socialism. And part of that means correcting against the misinterpretations of Marxism, especially those that are used to divide the Marxist struggle from the indigenous struggle, and the struggles of other oppressed identities and nationalities in the United States and globally. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and want to like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.